The unsurpassed meditative truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. So good to see you all here today. I'm going to sit back just a bit so I can actually take you all in, because it's quite a wide circle here. There. Well, we've just celebrated our annual festival in honor of Manjushri Bodhisattva, as you know, and I'd like to talk about living by wisdom. Let's first look at who is Manjushri Bodhisattva. Those of you who have been coming here for years know that she embodies the wisdom aspect of enlightenment, of Buddhahood, universal wisdom, in other words. And he or she is considered as an assistant of Shakyamuni Buddha and is considered the parent of Buddhas and trainer of bodhisattvas. So that which is training us in our bodhisattva training. In our tradition of Buddhism, there is usually a Manjushri, or Manju as it's called in Japanese, Manjushri statue in the monastic community's meditation hall. And it is said that Manjushri is the mother of all the trainees in the hall and watches over their training, our training. He appears as a monk sitting in meditation upon a wild-looking beast. That's one form. I'll show you a picture, which maybe we can get on camera, maybe not, of the Manjushri Bodhisattva in Sojiji at the time that Reverend Master Jiyu was training there, a beautiful Manjushri statue in the monks' hall of Sojiji Temple. I don't know if you can see it, probably not too well, but you see a monk sitting on this wonderful crazed-looking beast that's very pacified. There you go. That's pacified, but still has this somewhat crazed look, like any minute it could jump up and try to bite you. So a wonderful analogy of training with the selfish self. As I said, it appears as a monk sitting in meditation upon this wild-looking beast, the beast of self which is tamed and befriended and let go of as a result of sitting still within the arising of the passions of greed, anger, delusion, being with them, and then allowing them to pass without clinging to anything. Thus, they're gradually converted into compassion, love, and wisdom. Reverend Master Jiyu, in her chapter on the heart of Manjushri, in her book Zen is Eternal Life, refers to this as the trainee just living without thought of self or other, doing that which has to be done without fear or elation, taking notice of neither praise nor blame as a result of our actions. This would be the state that we are cultivating. She says the trainee will be living, when at this stage, as a top spins. You know, remember the tops, do they still have tops as toys for children? Living as a top spins, while seemingly busy outside, his or her center will be still and unmoving. So that's, for me, a wonderful image of what to do when I get very, very busy and there are multiple things coming at me in my job. I think it's a very helpful metaphor. Yeah. The wisdom of Manjushri Bodhisattva. So Buddhist wisdom, what is that? I asked Reverend Master Haryo something about this the other day. He mentioned that we teach about objectless wisdom. In other words, it's beyond wise ideas. Yeah. because I think maybe in our culture we're somewhat conditioned to try to grasp at wisdom and then hold on to it, and this is what we're going to do no matter what. And it's not necessarily an evolving, it doesn't take the law of impermanence and the myriad conditions into account. So he mentioned he has been teaching, doing some teaching. He was recently at one of our southern priories, and he's been talking about the unborn, but also in this case wisdom as a verb, not a noun, not a thing that can be nailed down, as I mentioned, not fixed in time and space. And I think this is what, for me, the scripture Great Wisdom points to. It points us to not clinging, also not pushing anything away, always going on, always becoming Buddha. And this is very important. This is why Reverend Master Jiyu chose to translate that mantra as going on beyond, always going on beyond, always becoming Buddha, rather than gone beyond, which has this sense of arriving, and then what do you do? You know. And this also expresses the very heart of Zazen practice, Manjushri's image and this teaching, training ourselves and living within the wisdom of serene reflection meditation. Thus, Manjushri Bodhisattva's appearance is often very youthful. He's a youthful prince, often shown as a very youthful figure. For me, this represents as the truth is arising from Manjushri, the heart of Manjushri's wisdom is always fresh and relevant, adapting to conditions. So there's a certain freshness in that. There's a certain constant presence and evolving to meet the needs, current needs, which is what we have in our training to bring to the world and to ourselves. Great Master Dogen, when asked upon his return from China to Japan, what he had found, he said that he found a flexible mind, heart is how we think of it. Reverend Master Jiyu also went on to say, to those who realize the heart of Manjushri, not only is duality transcended into unity, but the very unity itself is also transcended. And I'll just quote a little bit more from her chapter here on the heart of Manjushri. And the truth of Meister Eckhart's words proved for all time, and a man or a person shall be free and as pure as the day prior to his conception in his or her mother's womb, when he has nothing, wants nothing, and knows nothing. Such a one has true spiritual poverty. She's quoting the European Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. Bodhidharma put it this way, she says, the nature of the mind, or Buddha nature, when understood, no human words can compass or disclose. Enlightenment is not to be obtained, and he that gains it does not say he knows. Okay, very lofty ideals. So how do we put this into practice? What does this mean to us in our daily lives? How do we live by wisdom? How can we actualize it in our daily lives? Living a life of wisdom, which is what we aim to do. Of course, wisdom is always rooted in compassion and vice versa. They are completely one in a sense, and yet it helps to look at them separately as well. Of course, you all know, most of you, about Great Master Dogen's teaching on the four wisdoms, which is really based on some of the Buddhist teachings on the four means of embracing others. So these are wisdoms in Buddhism. Charity, cultivating charity. Again, these are verbs. These are, if you think of them as practices rather than things that you kind of get forever and ever. The practice of charity, the practice of tenderness, in particular with regard to speech, and the attitude of mind that we have towards others. the practice of benevolence, the practice of sympathy. These are attitudes of mind, but also wisdom in action, and very useful tools that we can actually all understand and work with in our daily lives. So I find it very interesting, it's one of my favorite subjects, that this is what we mean by wisdom in Buddhism. Yeah, it's not some far-off, obscure, abstract idea, intellectual idea necessarily. The intellect can be used in this, can be used benevolently, right, and sympathetically, but that's not where it stops. That's a very tiny, tiny part of it. And as I see it, wisdom is what actually works in our lives, in the world, on a universal scale. You know, like the precepts, of course, come into that. It's what actually works in the long run. And that's why it's always constant within stillness, but also ever-changing. I'll just quote a little bit from Great Master Dogen on the teaching of benevolence in one of his Shobogenzo chapters on the 4 exemplary acts of a bodhisattva. And this is part of this is in the Shishogi, of course. Showing benevolence, he says, means working out skillful methods by which to benefit sentient beings, be they of high or low station. One must do this, for instance, by looking at someone's future prospects, both immediate and far-ranging, and then practicing skillful means to help that person. Someone once took pity on a stricken turtle, and another once tended to a sick sparrow. These are classic Chinese stories about beings that were rescued. Neither of these people was seeking a reward. They simply acted from a feeling of benevolence. Some people may foolishly think that if they were to put the welfare of others first, their own benefits would be reduced. But this is not so. Benevolence is all-encompassing, universally benefiting both self and others. So these are big, big, very vast wisdoms. And yet they're very accessible to us. Well, I thought I'd just bring a couple of examples of benevolent and wise living into the talk. First of all, I thought I'd talk about a couple of things that I've heard about recently. One is the story of Marian Anderson. Many of you, most of you perhaps, might have heard of her. I didn't know very much about her, and I was just fascinated. She's an African-American woman who was born in 1872. I'm sorry, no. That was her parents. Anyway, 1897, that's right, and died at the age of 96 in 93. And of course, she became a very famous singer. But she was pursuing a singing career at a time when, Black Americans were not allowed into any institution, not even into schools, much less any musical training academies that were run by white people. I hesitate to use those terms, black and white, but that's what we use, but you know what I mean. Her grandfather was a slave actually, and was emancipated in 1860 and moved to Philadelphia. So it's a remarkable story of coming from a background of slavery to being an international, world-renowned super talent, really. What struck me so much about her story is the determination and undauntedness of this woman, and her dignity and the stillness that she brought to everything, it would seem. I was very impressed. She eventually managed, even though she wasn't allowed to enroll in music training at the time in the 20s and so on, she eventually had a lot of training and had a lot of singing opportunities in the Black community, and eventually went to Europe, where at least in the mid-20s to mid-30s, there wasn't the same sort of prejudice against African Americans. So she was well received. She became super popular in Scandinavian countries, and traveled all around Europe. This was, of course, before the Third Reich. She was even training and received training in Berlin. Once the Third Reich came into Germany, of course, they wouldn't let her in. But in most of Europe, she was received. She performed to nobles, kings, heads of state, etc. She had this amazing voice. She's an operatic singer, but didn't perform in operas because she's not an actress, just on the stage, and had an accompanist, a Finnish accompanist, who traveled with her. She had this voice, this contralto voice, very deep voice that was remarkable, but she had an amazing range, was able to go right up to mezzo-soprano, so she could do the whole thing. Learned all the traditional music, but she also did a lot of spirituals. And so after some time, she came back to the United States. I will say, when she was, a little anecdote that I found interesting, when she was performing in Russia, they had cautioned her to not sing the spirituals, nothing religious, and she decided to somewhat ignore that. But as she and her accompanist were leaving the stage, they heard this sort of thunderous sound, and they realized that they swear the audience went up to the stage and were pounding on the stage and chanting "Deep River, Deep River." They wanted her to sing "Deep River," which is a spiritual, and one that, kind of a slow-moving spiritual, if you've heard it, one that the slave owners used to prevent the people from singing. They would sing in the fields. So the spirituals really kept people going, and they encouraged the slaves, unfortunately, to sing the more up-tempo songs, the more cheerful ones, and didn't allow them to sing the sort of slower, deeper ones. But it does, if you haven't heard it, it speaks to the crossing the river to freedom. It has a number of levels of meaning, including on the spiritual level, as from the Buddhist perspective, crossing over to the other shore of suffering, away from freedom from suffering. And she did such a beautiful job of it because it requires a very wide range of voice. So I found that interesting. Here you are in Russia, you wouldn't expect that. This is mid-30s, 1930s, a different time. But there's that longing, that universal longing for something spiritual, something meaningful. So she came back to the United States, and she wasn't treated at all the way she was treated in Europe. So she had to contend with all the Jim Crow laws. She couldn't go to restaurants, the whole business, all the segregation, couldn't perform to white audiences, etc. It was very hard for her. And here she was, an international star. It took some time, but it turns out that Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, of course, became a great fan of hers, really loved her, and tried to promote her, tried to get her some singing venues, such as at the Constitution Hall. Unfortunately, apparently the Daughters of the American Revolution did not allow her to perform there because she was black. And Eleanor Roosevelt and quite a few other ladies resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution as a result. So the thing I wanted to bring out is, here's a woman who just was pursuing her singing career from very difficult circumstances, never gave up, kept going, but all through her life, her 96 years, she's breaking these barriers. She was the first person to sing at Carnegie Hall who was black, the first person who was able to perform at the Met Opera House, and so on and so forth. She broke all these barriers. Anyway, it turns out, even though she wasn't allowed to perform at Constitution Hall, Franklin Roosevelt, his wife, had probably been pestering him over and over about getting this woman a place to perform, and a few others who were supporting her. And they finally, FDR said, okay, let her perform at the Lincoln Memorial. So there's this very famous concert, I don't know if you've heard about it, 1939, before America entered the war, in front of the Lincoln Memorial. There she is, all by herself, and her accompanist. And I gather a crowd of 75,000 people turned up and millions listened to it on the radio, and this is really big, And there she was, singing Deep River, singing I guess she might have started out with My Country 'Tis of Thee. It's a beautiful rendering. It's on the internet if you want to listen to it. And there she was, in front of the massive statue of Lincoln, really very moving, actually. So constantly breaking, and it became really a very, very influential figure, human rights figure, right? Civil rights figure. Eventually worked with Martin Luther King as well. So I just thought I'd mention her. Let's see. One thing about her that I found interesting, also from what I learned, was when she's interviewed, which she was a lot. She was in public life. She worked for eventually the UN Human Rights Commission and numerous other things, as well as continuing her singing career. She received more honors and awards than I can count here. She received the first presidential Medal of Freedom, this kind of thing. I mean, just one, barrier after another. But she just keeps this kind of very steady, dignified presence. It's really impressive. And one thing, when you read her and hear her interviews, when she talks about herself, she refers to herself as we when being interviewed and talking about her life. And when asked about why she did that, she says she felt that her talent had come from God. And so the I was very small in this. So she was a very impressive person. And I think an example of just how this steadiness, how this sitting still and listening to your heart, listening to the still small voice, how it can, without intending to, be of beneficial to others, break through all these barriers. And she wasn't setting out to do that, I'm sure, not from the sound of her story. So a nice example there in more or less, contemporary. And there are many, many others, and it's happening all the time. Another one, going back to ancient times, of course, you've probably heard of King Ashoka, and a few centuries after the Buddha, who was an important Indian emperor of the Maurya dynasty and played a critical role in helping make Buddhism a world religion. Of course, he started out as a brutal, very power-hungry emperor, and took over countries around him, and he was nasty. He was a bad guy. But he had a conversion. He had a complete turnaround at a certain point. And that story is another whole Dharma talk, very interesting story. He had a complete turnaround, embraced the Buddhist teaching, and became one of the most kind, compassionate, and wise rulers in India, really, ever. Perhaps worldwide. I mean, really very interesting. I'm going to just quote a little bit, which I found highly interesting. Reverend Koten sent out this a little while ago, about Buddhist ideals in government. And the author of this, as a prelude, says, it must be remembered that the Buddha was born into a society which, comparatively speaking, was politically advanced and through the ages had developed certain very solid ideas of government. Let's see, the Hindus at that time already had laws hallowed by time to guide them in their civic duties and so on. These laws discussed not only the rights of the rulers, but also their duties towards their subjects. They also discussed the obligations of the subjects and their rights. The author of this book, however, goes on to explain, however, that such laws were laid down based on an assumption about the innate depravity of man, that man, ungoverned, lived according to the law of the jungle, and therefore a ruler needed to have the authority to divide, conquer, and control differing factions. And under such a system, the ruler had to have the power to impose punishments to keep people from harming one another for the sake of social stability and for the ruler's continuing safety. So you had the caste system as part of that, right? Okay. Such a system may seem simple to us today, but in the Buddha's day, the Brahmin hierarchy divided society into a system that was broken down into castes and levels and sanctioned by religion, in which human equality was lacking. We know about that. The Buddha went against that trend. He swam against the stream and welcomed all comers into the monastic order. Upali, who was a barber, and Sunita, who was a former outcast, both found places of honor in the Sangha. The Buddha said, monks, just as all the great rivers, that is to say the Ganges, the Jammu, the Achiramati, the Sarabu, and the Mahi, all reaching the great ocean, lose their former names and identities and are reckoned as the great ocean. Similarly, they all, monastics of all, people of all traditions are welcomed into the Sangha. So there are many such stories. And so the Buddha did give guidelines about what a virtuous ruler or leader, we don't have kings these days, but you can transpose that to any leadership position, governors, rulers of governments throughout the world. In line with Buddhist principles, he said the virtuous king should practice dana or charity, giving alms to the poor and gifts to those who serve the kingdom well. So we have something like the four wisdoms in here. The virtuous king should practice priyavachana, or kind speech, never using unkind words or harsh speech with anyone. The virtuous king or ruler should cultivate artacharya, which means acting in the spirit of service, as well as living a simple and frugal life. And the virtuous king or ruler should cultivate samanatma, excuse me for my pronunciation, samanatma, which means equality. Despite being in an exalted position, the ruler must never feel himself to be superior to the least of his subjects. And the virtuous ruler should learn to dispense justice to all his subjects without fear or favor. And finally, the virtuous ruler should treat all of his subjects equally. So this is, the Buddha's advice to people who are leading others. And in those days it would have been the kings, because there were many kingdoms in India. And he goes on to say, and I won't read it all, but there were moreover 10 royal virtues of the Buddhist ideal of kingship that the Buddha put forth as well. I'll just give you them briefly, but I won't go through the whole explanation. Again, dana, giving alms, sila, morality, precepts, being grateful for one's, being granting gifts and so on to those who are loyal and help you, being, practicing gratitude, being straightforward, not crooked or doubtful, using doubtful means to achieve your ends, and so on and so forth. Gentleness, restraint to the senses, non-hatred, non-violence. The monarch should not indulge in games where killing is resorted to or cause any injury to any being. He must practice non-violence to the greatest extent that is reconcilable with the duties of a ruler. Patience, non-enmity friendship, and so on. The Buddha also laid emphasis on the fact that the good and evil of the people depend on the behavior of their leaders. And for the good of the people, he set out these 10 royal virtues to be practiced by the rulers of men, rulers of beings. So that I found very interesting. I have some very good concrete examples there of how to do the job if you're in that job, right? And these are ideals. But it's this training that brings them to the actual. Of course, we don't have to be famous or in high positions in the world to live by wisdom as Buddhists. Everyone has some talent. Everyone has something to give, something to offer. And it's important always to remember that just by doing our training as best we can, doing that which needs to be done, and is helpful to ourselves and others in the deepest sense, that what we need to do will come to us. And drop my mat here. What is truly helpful will come to us. We don't have to look too far. Just need to keep the wheel of the Dharma turning by showing up each day for our meditation and training. We all have that vital work that needs to be done right before us, whether it's being really present and kind in our daily jobs, just washing the dishes, cleaning the house, taking care of ourselves, feeding our children, the dog, the cat, and so on. Helping those fleeing danger and starvation, in ways that are possible for us to do. And always dedicating the merit of our practice for the benefit of those in need, whoever and wherever they may be. So I'm just going to finish up here with another quote from Reverend Master Jiyu. This chapter of hers on the heart of Manjushri is one of my favorites. It's packed full of really helpful teaching. She says here then, in this spirit, it is the duty of every trainee to share with the world the glory of his own understanding, or hers, and this is done in many ways, not being confined to any one method. Remember that Avalokiteshvara, Kanzeon, reveals herself in the world in all walks of life and spheres of activity. The trainee may take up the work of a priest, a doctor or a nurse, a teacher, hotel keeper, or a servant, I might add, gardener, garbage collector, whatever, medical worker, caregiver. If he or she continues to keep up his training and does not become either ambitious, power-hungry, or superior in their own minds with regard to others, and especially their former teachers, they will be so different from that of ordinary people that all in the world will notice and want to copy him or her. Just by being an arhat, one is in fact a bodhisattva. By the above gentle method of teaching, which is always devoid of proselytizing, he or she will gradually lead others away from the idea of personal gain to higher things. Thus, Avalokiteshvara manifests herself at all times in the world of patience, as do all the bodhisattvas. And I will leave you with those thoughts for today. Thank you again for coming.